This one I actually learned about on my wedding day, and I feel like over in the States that would be borderline insulting. The marriage isn't legal over here. I can't believe that's even a thing. G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Caitlin and I'm an American living down under in beautiful Sydney, Australia. And I very recently got married to my Aussie husband. It was a beautiful day and I learned a lot about the overall wedding process over here in Australia. Yes, I'm actually wearing my wedding dress, but I wanted to put this on kind of just to get myself in the mindset of what it was like actually prepping and planning for this wedding, the differences that I've had to come across, not just in planning an international wedding, but learning about what was required legally in order for our marriage to be certified in Australia. Even though there are so many similarities between American and Australian weddings, there are some differences that I really wanted to highlight. So grab a Bicky, grab a cuppa, or if you have it in your fridge, grab a slice of a wedding cake, and let's jump right into this video. So the first big difference I noticed, and this was something I really noticed when I was looking at Facebook groups online just trying to get ideas, is this concept of a wishing well. So we have something similar over in the States, but we don't call it a wishing well. We just call it a card box, and some of them are pretty similar where it is just a standard cardboard box or a little metal cage or a little glass terrarium with maybe some acrylic designs or something on it. But one thing that I've seen over here in Australia that wasn't over in the States is people will design what looks like an actual well, like the wishing well from Snow White. And this is something that people put cards in. When I think of a wishing well back in the States, I might think of something where if someone's having a baby shower or a wedding shower, there might be a big hamper, and if it's a wedding shower, people will bring things like kitchen utensils and small towels and guest towels and whatnot, small little things to help fill up that basket. In baby showers, it might be things like diapers and toys and books, but over here, wishing wells are what we would typically think of as card boxes over in the States. The second thing, and this is becoming more of a trend in the States as well, is people aren't using guest books really anymore. It's so easy to get in touch with people nowadays with text and social media that if you need somebody's name or address, you can message them, you can text them, and chances are you already have all this information from when you set the guest list out anyway. So guest books, spending anywhere from like $20 to $200 on a guest book is something that is slowly fading out, or if people are doing guest books, they're doing something sentimental that they can keep. I've seen my cousin did this where she had everybody write on tiny little wooden hearts and it fit into this little wooden frame. I've also seen people who take Sharpie markers and write on something like a globe or write on the inside of an actual coffee table book. But that is slowly starting to fade out more and more over in the States. Here it seems like guest books are pretty much obsolete. People have gotten rid of them for a while. A lot of people just don't want to spend the money on something that's that unnecessary, and so many people don't use. Number 3 does come down a little bit more to personal preference, if you're religious, and honestly where you live, but it's becoming a lot more common to have outdoor weddings over here in Australia. There are so many weddings that I've seen outdoors, people talking about how they're getting married on farms or these beautiful luxurious Airbnbs or up in the Blue Mountains or on a beach somewhere. It's so much more common to have a beautiful outdoorsy wedding over here in Australia. In the States, it's becoming a little bit more popular to have maybe an actual backyard wedding, but typically a lot of these weddings are still held in either churches or really large function halls. Again, part of this does depend on where you live. If you're somewhere up north in the States, you're obviously not going to be getting married outside in the middle of winter when there's 3 feet of snow out. Over here in Australia, you might not want to get married like in Perth or Darwin in the middle of January where you're going to be absolutely melting in the sun. So outdoor weddings are very, very common. We actually got married outdoors at Mrs. McQuarrie's chair, and it was a beautiful outdoor ceremony, even though we did have to put up with a little bit of rain. Now this one I mispronounce all the time. It's going to be spelled correctly down below, but I think it's called a Bomboniere, which is pretty similar to favors. And this is something that both countries do. This is something that is also slowly starting to fade. It seems more so in Australia than in the States. I think in the States it's still kind of expected for people to get favors when they go to a wedding, whereas over here people don't really seem to care. People are opting more and more to save money and to not give those little $2 or $3 favors. Like, honestly, what is the point of having one little votive that has the couple's name on it where you have no place to put it in the house, or two mismatched coasters that don't go with any of your home decor? Obviously, people always appreciate things like food and whatnot, but if you already have dinner and you have a cake and you have desserts, why are you giving them just a little bit more food to go home with? It's a lot of people are opting to save money over here in Australia and are opting out of favors completely. So this one I actually learned about on my wedding day and it blew my mind. A friend of mine is a professionally trained chef, and when we went to a restaurant for dinner, she asked if it was alternate service. I had no idea what that was. So she had to explain to me, she's like, well, in a lot of catering places, what they'll do is they'll do alternative service where you don't have a choice of a main. They're either given a chicken or a fish or a steak and they just put it in front of you. And if it's not something you want, you could talk to the people around the table, see if anybody would want to switch, if anybody might be interested. So it's not something where you're given a menu, and I feel like over in the States that would be borderline insulting to not give people a choice in what they're eating. It's one thing if you're talking about somebody who has a dietary restriction. We're not talking about people who are vegetarian or vegan. They're obviously going to have their own separate plate. But if you have a group of carnivores like me and my husband are around a table and one person's getting chicken and one person's getting steak, why don't we both have the option to get the steak? I feel like in the States people would be really insulted if they didn't have the option to pick what they are going to eat. I've never ever heard of a catering company in the States that didn't give you at least 2 options for a main. We're looking at maybe having a small little party with my family and friends back in the States, and every place we've looked at, the menus do give you at least 2 options for a main course. So even though I understand it's probably a lot cheaper and easier on the caterer to do an alternative service menu, that is not something you would ever find over in the States. So this one I can only speak on from personal experience. This is going to vary differently depending on who your caterer is, what restaurant you use. There's so many factors that go into this over here in Australia. So when my partner and I decided to plan our wedding, we had it at a restaurant because we're having a really small number of people, and that restaurant tacked on a 10% gratuity for the waitstaff, which we understood it was a pretty large party and they were really attentive and really sweet. We had no problem paying that extra 10% gratuity at the end of the night. Whereas over in the States, if we would have had that same dinner at just a restaurant, at a steakhouse like we did, we would have easily been slammed with at least an 18% gratuity over there, not to mention taxes included. So the prices that we saw on the prefix menu wouldn't have had tax added in as well. But there is a pretty big gratuity difference. Everybody knows about tipping culture and whatnot over in the States. This is not the video for that, I won't get into it. But typically, gratuity over there is 18 to 20%. Over here, tipping is optional. So I think it depends on the restaurant you go to, the size of your party, the catering company you use. There are so many factors here that I could really only talk about my own personal experience with this one, but we had to pay a 10% gratuity where that same meal over in the States would have had about an 18 to 20% gratuity. So this one was a little bit surprising, and I saw it on a lot of Facebook pages when people were looking for honeymoon ideas. So many people honeymoon in Australia if you're Australian. So even though people do still go abroad, people will go to Europe, people will go to Asia, it's really common for a lot of Aussies to honeymoon in Australia. There's so much to see, there are so many places to travel to over here. A little bit cheaper, it's a little bit easier, and I think since we're just slowly coming out of this pandemic now, people are still a little bit wary of international travel. A lot of places have opened up their borders, so people are starting to plan more trips abroad, but it's really common now for Aussies to plan honeymoons that are still in Australia. Mark and I actually went to Hawaii back in July, so even though it wasn't like my hometown, it wasn't even the mainland US, it did feel a little bit more like home to me, and it was a very beautiful tropical getaway. We absolutely loved it. But a lot of Aussies are going towards Queensland now for a lot of honeymoon destinations. Obviously, Tasmania's always been really popular as well. If you want to get away from that tropical, beachy type of vacation and go towards something in the mountains, people will go and honeymoon in Tasmania often as well. There are a lot of options in Australia to travel, so a lot of Aussies do opt to honeymoon in Australia instead of going abroad or overseas, whereas in the States, it's only about 40% of American couples that will honeymoon within the actual US. A lot of people go to a Caribbean island is really, really common. Europe is also really popular. There are some people that'll do a longer honeymoon if they can afford the time away from work, to places like Southeast Asia. I know a couple people who've been to Jamaica and the Bahamas and Aruba and even Puerto Rico for their honeymoon over in the States. So it's very common to go actually outside of the US, or at least the mainland US. It seems like it's a lot more common for Aussies to honeymoon in Australia, whereas it's not as common for Americans to honeymoon in America. So one of the things I found out when I was doing research for my prospective marriage visa all the way back in 2020 is that marriage celebrants can't just be your family and friends. It has to be an actual celebrant, somebody who is legally able to marry you. And this leads into my next point. If you want to be a celebrant over here in Australia, you actually have to take a TAFE course. You have to get a certificate in Celibracy. I can't believe that's even a thing. I feel like they will do anything to make people take a TAFE course over here. But you can't just have a friend or family member certify your marriage. You have to go to an actual celebrant, and this person has to be actually registered with, I think it's births, deaths, and marriages. One of the perks of having a actual legal celebrant doing all this for you is they launch the paperwork. You don't have to deal with any of it. You have to meet with them at least a month ahead of time. I think it's 28 days ahead of time if you're here in New South Wales. Not sure if that's the same all across the country. I think it is though. But you have to meet with your celebrant at least a month before you're planning your wedding. They will launch the paperwork with births, deaths, and marriages within a month beforehand. They'll launch the notice of intended marriage, and then after the wedding they will go online and verify that the wedding has taken place. And then if you want to, you can order your official marriage certificate through New South Wales or whatever state you live in. It's been like 3 weeks and we're still waiting on ours, so it would be nice if they could speed that up just a little bit, please. But at least it's one less headache you have to deal with. You don't have to worry about remembering to bring the marriage certificate with you on your wedding or anything like that. The celebrant takes care of all of that for you. Which, funny story that my parents still tell. They got married in Philly back in the States. Now this was in 1990. They almost lost their marriage certificate the day before the wedding. They were frantic. They knew they couldn't get married if they didn't bring the marriage certificate with them the next day. So they were looking everywhere. They have no idea how, but somehow it ended up stuffed into a brown paper bag in the back of somebody's car. Nobody has any idea how that happened, but at least they found it, and they've been pretty happily married for over 30 years. So in the end, it worked out for them. Luckily, that's not something that Aussies have to worry about over here. So if you're getting married in Australia, or at the very least in New South Wales, I don't know if they do this everywhere, but you get an actual pamphlet. This information is provided pursuant to subsection 42(5)(a) of the Marriage Act of 1961. And it goes into a whole bunch of things in here. I mean, you've got the notice of intended marriage they talk about and the requirements of getting married in Australia, and then some important things you need to know about changing your name and citizenship and making a will, and of course taxation after marriage, because why not try to get more money out of you? And then before, during marriage, and marriage breakdown. And then at the very bottom, there's like family relationship advice line information. So your very typical government pamphlet. I have my phone in front of me because I need to read this out loud. So that way, because I'm not going to memorize some things, you guys. In order to make the marriage legal, there's a part of the vows that you have to say basically verbatim. You can't change or alter it. Now, obviously, you can write your own vows. You can have the traditional love, honor, cherish ones and whatnot if you want to throw those in there as well. You can make them as nice and long, as fluffy as you want, but they have to have this language in here. And if you're Aussie, I bet you've heard this one before. I call upon the persons here present to witness that I take thee to be my lawful wedded wife / husband / spouse. So without those words, without that vow actually in there and the witnesses that are signing off on it hearing that, the marriage isn't legal over here. So in the States, you can change your vows pretty easily. There are a lot of options. Even if you're getting married in a church, you typically get quite a few options for what you can say for your vows. But over here, this language has to be included in your vows no matter what. Otherwise, you're not legally married in Australia. So getting back to marriage certificates, because obviously that is the legally binding paperwork in all of this, is you don't actually sign your marriage certificate the day of your wedding. So typically what they do is they have a nice, pretty decorative certificate that you can sign, that you can have framed later, but that's not legally binding whatsoever. It's just a very pretty piece of paper on very nice cardstock that has both of your signatures on it and has absolutely no legal meaning behind it. Whereas over in the States, the marriage certificate that you sign the day of, along with the witnesses, is your actual certificate that does get filed with the county, with the township, wherever you live. So something a little bit more fun, a little bit more girly, I guess, are the wedding bouquets over here. And it's becoming a big trend globally, really, to use things like dried flowers and whatnot. But typically what you'll find are a lot of dried native Australian flowers in bouquets over here. Typically, a lot of Aussie brides opt for this more natural, this more native type of bouquet, especially with the trends going towards neutral tones and these really big like dried leaves and whatnot that you'll see in bouquets, whereas over in the States, people still typically stick to a particular color scheme that they want to include, or instead of using natural flowers in their area, they'll use the typical roses and hydrangea and lilies and whatnot. Here in Australia, it's really common to have things like eucalyptus and wattle seed and whatnot included in Aussie bouquets. Obviously, these flowers are pretty common over here. They are native Aussie flowers. And I know a lot of people are probably looking at this going, well, duh, they're in Australia. Of course they're going to put Aussie flowers in there. That's not always the case. It's not necessarily the common traditional trend to do that. This is something that has really started to pick up over here probably within the last 5 to 10 years from what I can see looking on like Pinterest and wedding trend boards and whatnot. A lot of Aussie brides want to use native Australia florals in their wedding bouquets. Now, when we were looking at venues to have our actual wedding dinner afterwards, I was going crazy with this one. Every place that was an open bar was just beer and wine. Over in the States, you get the options of doing things like a cash bar, which I'm personally not a fan of. You have beer and wine bars, which I've been to some of those and they're not bad. And then you have an actual open bar, which is just a full array of spirits and cocktails. Some people do their own cute little like custom cocktail for the day of. But in Australia, an open bar typically just means a beer and wine package. So you can have a selection of reds and whites and sparklings. You have light beer, you have imported beer, but that's it. You just get beer and wine. And even though I'll drink wine, we wanted a little bit more of a selection. Mark is a Scotch drinker. He isn't really much of a beer drinker at all, and honestly neither am I. So having a beer and wine package wouldn't have really done much for us. So every place that we were looking at, we ended up having to ditch the actual premium package that they offered, like whatever their drink package was, and we ended up opting for a pay on consumption. So whatever drink people ordered, whether it was a Coke or whether it was a $50 shot of bourbon or something, that was what we ended up paying for at the end of the night on our bill. Over in the States, if you have an open bar or you tell people it's an open bar, they're going to expect whiskey, rum, tequila, vodka. They're going to expect all of it, and they're going to expect name brand as well. You're not just going to get the house whiskey, you're going to get Jack Daniels. You're not just going to get the house vodka, you're going to get Absolute, you're going to get Smirnoff, you might even get Grey Goose if you're at a very fancy-ish catering hall. But over here, you have to pay on a per consumption basis in a lot of places if you want something besides just beer and wine. Isn't it always the way that you get to the very last point and your camera battery dies? So the last thing on this list is a lot of Aussies are opting to use Airbnbs for their wedding, whether it's just to get married on the estate for a day or two or to have a nice little long weekend with a dozen family and friends. People are renting out these beautiful little cabins all the way up in the Blue Mountains, or these lovely homes along a beach somewhere with a beautiful sunset view. People aren't just having the typical one-day wedding. A lot of people are turning it into a long weekend experience, a little bit of a getaway for family and friends, and it gives everybody the chance to get away to a beautiful location for a weekend to celebrate the couple. And this is something that's becoming more of a trend in Australia. This isn't something that's really picked up so much in the States, and I think Typically, a lot of Americans do think of weddings as just being that one day or that one afternoon/evening event. Not a lot of people are going to be able to go for a long weekend on a nice little Airbnb wedding. Typically, weddings are one-day events over in the States, and even though that is the norm over here in Australia, and I think it will be for the vast majority of couples, it's becoming a little bit more common for that small little subsect of couples to opt to get Airbnbs for an entire weekend and celebrate with everybody there rather than to just have a little one-day event. So if you guys like this video, hit the like and subscribe button. It really does help grow this channel and really does help support me. I talk about the differences between American and Australian culture and the overall process of learning to live down under. My name's Caitlin, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!